Good afternoon, and welcome to you for joining, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Brad Lubben. I'm an associate professor and ag policy specialist here with the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The Center for Ag Profitability has a long-standing series of webinars available. You can find a schedule of upcoming webinars. You can find an archived copy of previous webinars, all on our website at cap.unl.edu. Today's webinar is entitled Government Programs and Policies in Livestock. Since 2008, when livestock actually had its first major title within a farm bill, the federal government has continued to provide more and more assistance to livestock producers in various ways. This includes new federal programs, changes to some existing programs, and an increasing amount of ad hoc assistance payments over the past several years. Today, we want to describe the history and growth of government programs and government activities in the livestock sector. We want to talk about an overview of all the programs that are out there today, and want to discuss whether this role is ultimately where we're headed for the future with agriculture and policy and livestock producers. As I said, I'm Brad Lubben, and I'll be one of your co-presenters today, but I want to introduce my other colleague and co-presenter. Elliott Dennis is an assistant professor and livestock economist here with the Center for Ag Profitability. All of us in the Department of Ag Economics here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So Elliott's going to start the presentation, and we'll be back and forth with several issues and topics as we go.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Brad, and appreciate everyone taking the time out of their busy week to join the webinar. Today it's a little bit snowy here, so we're glad to be. Hopefully you've taken some time, and let's get into it. So we first wanted to start off by just talking about just the breadth of kind of where these programs are administered from. So often we talk about the government's role, but oftentimes when we talk about certain programs, we talk about the administration of those programs within a certain subsection, generally within the United States Department of Agriculture. We say USDA Department of Agriculture, but that's because that's where the majority of the programs have begun to be administered from. But it is important to note that other programs such as the Food and Drug Administration, monitoring the veterinary feed directives and antimicrobial use and resistance programs is coming out of the FDA, which is a big change from where those programs usually are at. But on the bottom hand side, this is basically an organizational chart of the United States Department of Agriculture, commonly referred to as the USDA. And there's lots of these programs that you might be familiar with. So the Farm and Foreign Ag Services, that's where the FSA office is located under. The Farm Service Agency, the Foreign Ag Service, and Risk Management Agency, or RMA. So if you've ever taken out livestock risk protection, livestock gross margin, that would be administered through RMA. Farm Service Agency, that would be like the Livestock Indemnity Program and other programs. When we're talking about prices and price reporting, mandatory price reporting, or potentially some of those concerns about packer capacity, that's over here on this right-hand side, the marketing and regulatory programs. So the Ag Marketing Service, or commonly referred to as AMS. Then we have Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, sometimes referred to as APHIS. So that new RFID tag regulation that's coming out, that would be out of APHIS. And the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Administration, commonly referred to as GIPSA. This is where when we're investigating unfair market competition and trying to determine, say, packer capacity if that's damaging the the markets, that's where those types of studies would come out of. So these programs generally work really well within their own agency, but there is some difficulty in the communication across these different programs. And so if we're ever educating on different programs, we tend to focus on a program that's administered within a certain agency, but just know that these don't really connect well. And ultimately, these agencies are implementing rules and regulations that are really passed from the United States Congress. The Senate and the House of Representatives create rules. The agencies are then given some delegation to implement those rules. So Brad, why don't you take it over and talk a little bit about kind of what's in these different types of programs?
So let's think about a portfolio of programs that do offer assistance to livestock producers. One of the primary components comes from the standing disaster assistance programs that were first authorized in the 2008 Farm Bill. We can talk about a history of ad hoc and assistance and other emergency assistance over time, but the 2008 Farm Bill was when we first put these into legislated authority. They include a number of disaster programs, 3 of them with relevance here for the livestock sector. The Livestock Indemnity Program pays for abnormally high death losses that are due to disaster events. The Livestock Forage Program pays for forage and grazing losses due to drought and uses the U.S. Drought Monitor, that drought monitor that's produced here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. But it uses that drought monitor to determine which counties are eligible and for how much assistance under the LFP program. And then there is the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program. Actually, the long title would be the Emergency Assistance Program for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish, just to remind you how extensive and broad this maybe really is. But that's a program that really provides the secretary with the authority to respond to issues and emergencies as they occur to provide relevant assistance to producers. Some of the additional drought assistance or maybe fire loss recovery can come through that program, as well as some animal disease and other assistance that might come through that program. So that's the standing disaster assistance programs that were first established in 2008. Those are technically permanent and permanently authorized, so they don't need further legislation. They are just there when issues and emergencies arise. But we've also had a long-standing debate between these authorized programs and the ad hoc programs. And historically, ad hoc programs were the vehicle to roll out any assistance for both crop and livestock producers. The debate has been going on since the 1980s. Actually, I could refer you to some historical documentation that would say the debate over disaster assistance dates to the 1880s. But fundamentally, what we know today, we can think of debate for the better part of the last 40 years of what's the role of disaster assistance and what can it provide. That disaster assistance perhaps peaked here most recently in the midst of the COVID pandemic and substantial COVID relief that we knew as the CFAP program, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, and payments to livestock and crop producers, but fundamentally substantial payments there. Of course, this disaster relief is somewhat political in the sense that it may be legislated by Congress. It might also be administered and determined directly by the Secretary of Agriculture with existing authority that they have under the Commodity Credit Corporation. The Trump administration rolled out trade assistance in 2018 and 2019 under that authority. The Biden administration has rolled out some additional relief, including some of the cover crop or other relief here that they've used that same authorization for. So there is the ad hoc debate, there's the congressional role, there is also fundamentally this administrative role about how to roll out relief in times of need. Now, that's authorized relief, that's ad hoc relief, and then there is the authorization and support for livestock programs that offer another opportunity for disaster assistance to producers and substantial price risk management opportunities here for livestock producers. Elliott's done quite a bit of education in this area. I'll let him describe the detail here a bit more.
Yeah, so the real change has been from, do we provide assistance in response to disaster programs or disaster events, or do we encourage producers to then take basically a management decision in order to control some of those risks? In economics, we know in a competitive market that changes in supply and demand are going to be transmitted along the supply chain through price. And so any of those, let's say a bomb cyclone that reduces supply, that's going to have an increase in price. If we're talking about the kind of the COVID issues where we had kind of backup in the supply chain that really depressed price, all of those fundamentals are going to be ultimately translated into what people believe is the change in supply and demand. And so by providing these price-based, or in the crop market space, it'd be revenue-based products, we can actually subsidize, or the government goes and subsidizes producers to basically make a management decision. And so the two most common products that are administered through the livestock or the risk management agency is the livestock risk protection, sometimes referred to as LRP, was previously referred to as LRI, so you might have heard it called that. And that is basically a put option that's an at the money or out of the money put option. And margin-based products, which is the livestock gross margin, it is simple, and the margin products essentially simulates the crush, whether it's a soybean crush or the cattle crush, and helps people manage that margin. And so this chart on the left-hand, bottom left-hand side, this shows the number of head that are insured under the livestock gross margin on the left-hand side, and the livestock risk protection program that's on the right-hand side. And the different colors on the graph indicate the actual commodity that's being insured. Pink being swine, this green bar is feeder cattle, and the red bar, or sorry, this yellow bar is the fed cattle or fat cattle. And really the purpose of showing this is that the USDA underwent several policies to try to make this product more usable and for livestock producers. Some of those have been changing the number of time that a producer can sell the animals. You have up to 60 days prior to that contract expiring, where you can sell cattle or swine. You have the premiums now due at the end of the period rather than the beginning of the period. And most importantly, the subsidy has really gone up. Prior to 2018, there was really no change from the product when it was first initiated in 2003 till about 2018. Then from about 2018 to 2020, there are 3 substantive changes, all in the form of subsidies. And now the current subsidy ranges from about 35% of the premium to about 55% of the premium. And when you compare that historically over to what a put option is pricing at, particularly in closer months, it tends to be trading at a pretty significant premium. Basically, what that means is you can buy the same level of coverage through livestock risk protection cheaper than you could buy it than if you were to go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Now, there's reasons why you'd use one or the other, but the point is that the federal government, and particularly through the risk management agency, is trying to, instead of providing large sums of payments to producers in the form of disaster assistance payments programs, how do we help producers to understand some of the risks that are out there and then make a management decision and then subsidize that management decision rather than providing ad hoc assistance? And if you're interested in where these quotes are or how to get those, you can scan this QR code. We'll be providing all of the slides for you to use and download. And just as a reminder, if you have questions as we're going through this, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get them either during the program or directly after when we have our Q&A session.
Let's go forward there a slide. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about some additional assistance as well. You've got sort of 3 different economic assistance programs there, with disaster assistance, as well as the ad hoc assistance, and now the livestock risk protection or livestock risk management tools. We also see substantial role for livestock producers in the conservation programs that were rolled out by USDA. There really have historically been 3 types of programs implemented through USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service or Farm Service Agency. Most of those, or most of the new dollars, are really pushed towards working lands programs. Think of the EQIP program and the CSP program, but also the new component of CRP, the CRP grassland program, which provides for payments to producers on land that stays in grazing and forage production, but in an environmentally managed sort of protocol. Working lands have been a growing area where livestock producers have historically played a significant part or have been a significant recipient. The land retirement programs, think of the rest of the CRP, the general provisions and the continuous provisions. That chart down there at the right bottom corner of the screen is the CRP enrollment. It was general when it was authorized in 1985, and it was fundamentally targeted at cropland and enrolling cropland in a retirement program. That peaked. Over time, we introduced something called the continuous CRP, which targeted more environmentally sensitive lands, partial fields instead of whole fields, as an example, buffer strips, amongst other things. And the total enrollment in CRP has declined since the mid-2000s. But then that very last couple bars there, you see an uptick in a category, and that's the grassland CRP, taking off dramatically here in terms of enrollment and interest and opportunity for livestock producers. So you've got working lands programs, you do have the retirement programs, you also have the land preservation programs. The Ag Conservation Easement Program includes both farmland and wetland easements that are opportunities for producers to keep land, to preserve it, as opposed to watch it move to other kinds of development. So substantial components here, actually more dollars rolling out in conservation right now than rolling out in commodity programs. Those are some of the roles where the government is playing an active role through Farm Bill and other legislation to provide assistance to producers. There's also a fundamental discussion about what the government's role is in the marketplace. And again, Elliott, I'll let you describe the market perspective here.
Yeah, so when we're talking about kind of this programs that are out there for producers to use, we often talk about it from the economics standpoint of why is there a government involvement? And I think there's really two competing interests on this. I'll maybe talk about the economic reason, then pass it off to you for the government justification. But when we look at it from the economic side, we say there's a market failure. If we're in a competitive market and the individual producers within that market are unable to efficiently allocate in the short run or the long run, then the government can come in and through subsidies or changes in policies or regulation, basically improve the market. And there's some reasons why, it may not be in a private interest to do something, but maybe in the society's interest to do something. And so we call those externalities. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying maybe my behavior affects your behavior, but I don't account that cost. The classic example that we often use is a honeybee producer and a fruit farm. I'm growing honey. If I'm raising honeybees and there's an orchard next to me, then we both benefit because my bees are pollinating your basically orchard. You get more fruit production, but I also have that more productivity. So I have more honey and you have more fruit. And so we both benefit. That would be what we'd call a positive externality. The opposite of that would be a negative externality if we have let's say a processing plant that dumps all of its waste in the river, and then downstream I have a fish farm and it kills all my fish. Well, then that's what we call a negative externality, or your behavior is affecting me and inhibiting my ability to do business. And so in a lot of ways, the government tries to figure out what ways is there market failure, and if so, can we step in and potentially help remedy those? And that's a difficult situation because sometimes producers might be on a bad end, or the processing industry might be on a bad end of market events, and we might see or believe that there is a reason for the government involvement, but it may not be. It may just be a short-term thing. And that's really where this government justification really kind of meets the road of, is it a short-term or is it a long run? And you can speak to that, Brad.
Yeah, it's a fundamental challenge when we talk about any government policy. What's the role of government in agriculture? What's the role of government in infrastructure? What's the role of government in social services, et cetera? It's about where the government plays a role and The economic reasons, as Elliott described, there's questions about market performance or market failure. There's questions about externalities, traditional reasons why there might be a role for government. There's also the reality that this is a political environment, and the political economy. There's a whole theory of political economy that helps describe how interests propose and support efforts for government intervention. We could look, for example, at Title I commodity programs in the Farm Bill and note that some of the design of those programs is addressing the fact that if agricultural markets are inherently inelastic, as we economically describe, that is the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, neither one respond to price very quickly. Supply is sort of fixed within a given year. Once you've made production decisions, demand is relatively stable based on population and food demand. Markets may be unstable, and there's a reason to intervene in markets that are relatively unstable. But once that intervention occurs, there's also then an entire sort of political base that asks for or that increasingly depends on that government intervention. And so it's both an economic question and a political question that play out in terms of Farm Bill legislation from time to time. And we'll see that in the coming slides here. Elliott, if we'll go to the next one here. If we talk about the Farm Bill, and first acknowledge a Farm Bill is due this year. If it is to be debated and completed on time, we are expecting a 2023 Farm Bill. But a Farm Bill encompasses a broad range of programs. When we think about production agriculture and crop production, livestock production, the Farm Bill historically was thought to be much more about crops, relatively little about livestock prior to the last 20 years or so. That's not counting dairy, and that's not counting historical programs that existed for wool and mohair that have since been discontinued. But fundamentally, livestock played a relatively small role in the Farm Bill, and even some livestock groups like to sort of stand up and say, just please keep us out of the Farm Bill. We're not participants in Title I commodity programs. No, but Title I commodity programs that do support crop production indirectly support feed supplies. And so even if the livestock sector isn't a direct participant, it's still a direct or indirect beneficiary of some of those policies. And that might be true in terms of feed production, commodity production that's helped supported by Title I. That's also fundamentally true of energy policy. Energy policy that drives the development of the biofuel sector has driven some competition for primary feedstuffs like corn and soybeans going to biodiesel instead of directly to processing. But lo and behold, the co-products of those same industries have provided feedstuffs for the ag sector, which helps offset that. So maybe it's indirect support. It's not directly authorized or not directly pointed to in the legislation, but the livestock sector certainly has been a primary or an indirect recipient of some of that support as well. That's also true when we talk about the broader Farm Bill and we think about the different components of the bill. There's a role for the commodity title. There's a role for the conservation title. There's a role for what is now included as an insurance title. And Elliott's described some of those growth in those programs already. But perhaps no surprise, the biggest part of the Farm Bill is the nutrition title. And the nutrition title in the Farm Bill specifically tends to focus on food assistance through the Supplemental Nutrition and Assistance Program, which lends back to the debate of, well, what's the impact here on the ag sector? What does the nutrition title do for the ag sector? Well, if you look at the relative funding, the nutrition title overwhelms every other component of that Farm Bill. The nutrition title is expected to cost $1.2 to $1.3 trillion over the next 10 years, just to continue current programs forward. That is approximately 85+% of the total cost of the farm legislation. And that is the component that has increased the most over the last 5 years. That chart on the left is the estimated cost over a 10-year baseline of the 2018 Farm Bill when it was passed versus the updated baseline just published by the Congressional Budget Office last month. That substantial increase in funding is all concentrated in the nutrition title, which gets back to the debate. Then why is the nutrition title part of a farm bill? It's definitely not just a farm bill. It's a farm and food bill. But why are they linked together? And maybe we go to the next slide and have a discussion here. On the right is a long list of all the different titles in a farm bill. But fundamentally, think of how much of that farm bill would be attractive to Congress if it did not include the nutrition title. And yes, we could say there's definitely farm interest in commodities, there's broad interest in conservation, there's interest in trade, there's interest in research and development, there's interest in specialty crops and other things. But how much political support would there be if the farm and the food were disconnected? That's the fundamental argument that tends to get back to there's a reason farm and food come together. Farm Coalition and the Food Coalition come together to debate and ultimately push a farm bill on a regular basis here. Elliott, your point, don't like it, wait 5 more years. Well, that's the fundamental debate of there is continually a farm bill debate with us. It's due approximately every 5 years, but it is ultimately about building a coalition and focusing on where we go with farm policy in an overall farm bill. The next title reinforces that. Livestock indirectly benefit from commodity program support. Livestock producers directly benefit from some of the conservation programs, some of the insurance programs, obviously some of the research, trade, and other programs as well. Livestock producers, however, have sometimes said, we don't want a livestock title or just sort of keep us out of the farm bill debate. Well, historically, a livestock title today has been a question about whether there is or whether there isn't a focus on livestock, broadly speaking, in the Farm Bill. The 2008 Farm Bill included a livestock title. And if you read closely there, you can figure out some of the things that it included. But those are policies that aren't specifically about market or economic support. Those are policies often more about market and regulatory activity that often get discussed here. So let me turn it back, Elliott, to comment here from you as well.
Yeah, I would say that if you just look at Title 11, as you mentioned in the 2008 Farm Bill, even the current discussion that we're having about the 2023 Farm Bill, some of those would be very familiar, such as country origin labeling, and even some issues about or questions about, animal health plans and disease traceability, and right there on section 11005, the production contracts. I mean, some of these are kind of reoccurring concerns, but as you mentioned, it tends to be more regulatory rather than market assistance to this point. And so when we talk about, as economists, we tend not to think of something good or bad. We tend to think about what is the trade-offs. And so as we talk about, what are the current issues or some of those things that were being debated, we've already talked about the Farm Bill. That's going to be happening hopefully this year. That's going to be heavily debated. But if there is a livestock title, what's going to go into that title? There's a lot of things that people are advocating for, both to be included and those not to be included. But it's also important that there are legislations that happen in between farm bills that have the potential to really impact the industry. And the two that have been getting a lot of attention over the last 2 or 3 years, which we'll briefly touch on, is this idea of mandatory price minimums in the fed cattle market, and also mandatory price reporting, or how prices are reported throughout the supply chain. And briefly, if you're not familiar with these, the mandatory price minimums was a bill that was introduced a couple years ago, was reintroduced again this year. And really what it does is it sets a requirement for the type of cattle to be traded in the fed cattle market to happen a certain way. And specifically, they'd have to be sold negotiated cash or negotiated grid. And there's different levels on minimums that people are calling for. This is still under debate. There's, I think, some urgency from both the Congress and from some people within the industry that says we need to do something, whether it's these minimums or whether we encourage or incentivize people to do other things to participate in this market. There, something needs to be done. Now, we've done some work on this and some policy analysis on, what would be the trade-offs. We don't take a position on whether these would be good or bad, but Brad and I have done some work on, what would be the benefit and costs of certain policies that were proposed. And the other one is mandatory price reporting. During COVID, this obviously got highlighted, and as prices started to rise at retail. And what we really want to emphasize here is that as producers or people in the industry, if we didn't have mandatory price reporting, where would we get prices? Prior to this, mandatory price reporting that really began in from 2001 to 2003, but really hit off the bat in 2004, everything was voluntary in price reporting. And if you remember why mandatory price reporting became available or required, was because we had the large drop off in this hog prices in the 1990s. That really led to just people saying there is no transparency in the market. We need producers and processors to report prices they're paying, so everyone knows in the industry, and that's what led to the mandatory price reporting. This has to be reauthorized every so many years, and so making sure, seeing if that's something that we want to continue to renew in the future. And all of these, it says that whether they're good or they're bad, I think people have an opinion on whether they believe they're helping the market or they're not helping the market. So the last is, no matter what that opinion is to make your voice heard. And that's some of our encouragement for you today, says that these are the programs and policies out there. These are some of the things that are coming in the future. If there's things that you like about the program, things you don't like about the program, then to make that heard, there's lots of ways that you can do that. On the local level, we have kind of county or zoning issues from our state, and whatever state you're in. But here in Nebraska, we have state legislation such as brand laws or EID tags. And on the national level, they have larger policies such as the RFID tag that was recently introduced. But in all of these, there is a notice and comment period. And that notice and comment is allowed for producers to kind of voice their opinion and their thoughts as far as the legislation that's being offered. And they do listen and they do make changes to those policies. And sometimes they get rid of policies and rules altogether. And just recognizing that even within your own commodities, specific commodities, there's advocacy groups out there. We pointed out the pork checkoff dollars and the beef checkoff dollars, but even there you have your local organization and national organizations where you can advocate for your thoughts and opinions on these. Well, we hope that's been helpful. Like I said, we're trying to provide a broad overview of kind of what's out there, kind of what's coming. And I think we'll take questions if you'd like to put them in the Q&A or the chat box, and we will, and we're happy to stay on as long as we would like and to share those.
That's right. Thank you, Elliott. Thank you, Brad. This is Ryan Evans here at the Center for Ag Profitability. Again, inviting your questions right now. You can type those into the Q&A panel or put those in the chat box. And if you're watching us on Facebook, I'm also monitoring that. So you can leave a comment there on Facebook, and we'll do our best to get those questions answered.
Ryan, I may preemptively offer an answer to a question that hasn't been asked. So
Perfect.
So I'll take presenter's prerogative here, but we talked about a farm bill. 2023 farm bill is due this year. The debate has been underway. One of the challenges of trying to get a farm bill complete this year isn't just the sort of the political debate and climate in Washington, D.C. That's always there, maybe as difficult as ever. But ultimately, historically, politically, farm bills have come together. Farm bills tend to be more parochial than partisan, we would say. They tend to come together based on regional or commodity interests more so than party lines. So there's reason to think that we can get a farm bill complete this year. There are also the fundamental challenges of with the budget challenges being what they are and the projected spending on a farm bill being what it is. The opportunity to make any sort of changes to policy or to make any sort of reforms to current programs is going to be really, really challenging. That may get held up more politically, and it certainly could get held up in terms of constraints on new options. That might mean that lots of things we're talking about, whether it is commodity supports or conservation or other things, are largely confined to being status quo. Keep the existing policies moving forward because there's not fundamentally much budget dollars available to make substantial changes. That might mean for livestock producers that we continue to see opportunities in the conservation title, opportunities with trade promotion, opportunities with the insurance products, but that those things would largely look like they have over the last several years. That's all if we get a farm bill done. There's also the likelihood that we don't get a farm bill done and that we simply extend current policy for another year or more as the debate lingers. So that's a brief outlook that nobody specifically asked for, but maybe it sets a stage for where we think we're going with some of these policies.
Great. Well, thank you, Brad. And again, we'll remind you if you have a question to enter that in the chat box or in the Q&A box. So the first one here is of the Farm Bill hearings or listening sessions that have been held so far this year. Have there been any livestock issues that have been brought forth in those hearings or listening sessions?
I would mention livestock producers have, or livestock groups have certainly mentioned the importance of the insurance products and the opportunity for continued growth and development of those products. They have also mentioned a topic we haven't covered, and that is animal disease management and preparedness. A vaccine bank or a animal disease management strategy has been a critical issue. And again, let me defer to you, Elliott, to give a perspective that goes deeper.
Yeah, and I would also say the country of origin labeling. There's a large push to clarify what country of origin labeling means. And so the push there amongst these sessions have been born, raised, and harvested, not just harvested in the US. So that would be combating some of the imports from Canada and Mexico, either on the feeder cattle side or the fed cattle side, that would come in and be harvested and then be classified as or sold back to Canada as product of USA. So I think there's clarifications of those, but definitely the disease management traceability is probably the one that people have most been talking about, and largely that's been coming because of APHIS's policy on interstate movement of breeding stock, so cattle that are over 18 months of age. And I think that just kind of highlights the, as we start to develop and as we become more reliant upon exports, where are we at as far as kind of pressure to make sure we can contain and monitor and trace disease. And just for perspective there, the United States is the only state that has, or country of, the 15 largest beef producing locations that doesn't have a mandatory traceability program. And so that if we do get a foreign animal disease, which thankfully we haven't, with the exception of that one case of BSE, that it could be pretty detrimental to both our market access in the short run and the long run. So example there is that Japan, we got reauthorized to start trading out of there with no restrictions. But those restrictions came off only 2 or 3 years ago. Well, that was 15 or 16 years post BSE that those came off. So those can tend to be on for a long time. So those are the things that we're hearing. There's obviously other ones like competition, but those are the main highlights.
And Elliott, I might even double back on that. Your discussion of cool certainly is relevant and interesting. I studied cool as a graduate student back in 2005. It was the '02 Farm Bill that first introduced country of origin labeling, proposed it then as a mandatory rule. That mandatory rule was put into effect and ultimately tested in the WTO and found to be non-compliant. So for meat products, the mandatory rule disappeared, and ever since then, the administration has been working towards or working with issues of how do you label a product. The current proposal is a redefinition or a vision of the regulation for the term product of the USA, not to implement a mandatory labeling requirement, but to change the rules for how that labeling term would be used. And so the born, raised, and processed in the United States requirement to be a product of the USA versus the historical, if a stage was done here in the US, it is a product of the US. And so, so that's the debate that's moving forward there. That may very well get wrapped up in a farm bill discussion here before the year is out.
And one of those things that we haven't talked, we've obviously focused a lot on the government regulation in this presentation, but producers are well aware that there's many private industries that are seeking to kind of regulate the industry itself. So think of large multinational corporations coming out and requiring certain restrictive farming practices in order to participate in their food marketing chain. This would be mainly like the all natural or no antibiotics, no hormones by companies that have stated that they don't want their products to have that. And so that forces some producers to make changes. And so that's not necessarily a government regulation saying no one has to to do that production practice, but it's definitely restricting in the sense of if you want to participate in that supply chain, that you can't participate in those or engage in those production practices.
All right, thank you, Elliott, Brad. Thanks for the question too. Just a reminder, we do have some time. If you have questions yet, please type those in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we'll hang on here for another minute or so and see if anything comes in. I did also put a link in the chat box to our webinar evaluation. It's just a short 3-question survey. If you can take the time to offer your feedback on today's webinar and any ideas you have for future webinars and topics to be covered in those, we would really appreciate that. So right now, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. Give you about 1 more minute here. Just remind you, we'll be back next week. We're taking a break from our traditional webinar series. We're going to have a couple of webinars, longer format webinars on land management topics with issues facing landlords and tenants, and some leasing and management strategies for this upcoming year. So as always, you can check those out on our website at cap.unl.edu. You'll find a recording of today's webinar there as well, probably in the next 24 hours or so. With that, Elliott, Brad, I think you've explained things so well that nobody else has any questions remaining. Oh, here we got one that came in.
I would mention, Ryan, also that if they're interested in this topic, that we'll be doing also a webinar on April 6th that will be specifically focusing on CRP grassland. And we'll have the administrators of that program, the national administrators. We'll have a producer who's used CRP grassland, and also a county agent who enrolls people in CRP grassland. So I think it'll be a good opportunity to see 3 different perspectives from a national, how do they administer it, to a producer, person who's signing up producers, to a producer who has actually participate in the program to get those kind of 3 perspectives. So that will be happening April 6th. And that's was a specific program that Brad mentioned that's administered as part of this.
Yeah, thanks, Elliott. And that registration is open on our website as well right now, tap.unl.edu. Question came in related to carbon credits. Just wondering if you have an opinion on if one should be concerned to lease carbon credits with the increasing regulation.
If I take a stab at it, I first would have to say that's worthy of its own webinar or 5-hour program. But the 30-second answer, let's hope. There are certainly carbon credit opportunities. There are market opportunities to sell credits to entities that are voluntarily purchasing them. So that market is a voluntary driven market. There are a few regions where there is a regulatory driven market for credits, but not here at Nebraska, not here in Nebraska right now. There's a California market, there's a New England market, there's a European market. If you're selling credits in Nebraska, you're selling them to a voluntary buyer that wants to buy them to help offset their credits or to increase their environmental footprint for purposes of their messaging or marketing efforts. There are opportunities. They come with a wide range of contract opportunities and potential payments and potential requirements and expectations and commitments. And so it's very difficult to generalize them here and with a single concluding remark. Within the farm policy that we talked about today in the Farm Bill, there are increasing opportunities in the conservation programs for climate-based practices. And so the same kind of practice might be worth or might be able to enroll in conservation programs and receive conservation benefits. That's essentially the federal government stepping in and saying, we're going to play a role to promote these practices and benefits distinct from the marketplace trying to purchase them. So there is a market opportunity. There is also a incentive program, conservation program opportunity for producers that are interested. There could be opportunities to do both, but I'd suggest you want to look at them closely and figure out what you're willing to commit to and what you're willing to live with for an appropriate or available economic return.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Brad, that most of this, when I assuming the regulation is meaning how those carbon credits are bought and sold and the requirements in those contracts, kind of having a standardized contract. I think those would likely come. Now the production practices that they would be paid for, the additionality or the new production practices you'd engage in, I don't think that would be regulated. I think what's the current conversation that's happening is more about, can we prove that it does actually, that production practice does capture carbon in particular. So think of like rotational grazing in the cattle side versus different a change in fertilizer, so from the cattle side, where most of that stuff has been in the either rotational grazing or in cover crops, longer grazing. And I'd say most of those carbon credits tend to be actually concentrated in the cow-calf segment rather than the feedlot segment, where we tend to see some of those probably net user of environmental footprint along from the feedlot side. So my last comment would then be just to be careful, as if you're wanting to participate along the supply chain, particularly for cattle. If you're a cow-calf producer and you sell those carbon credits as for the cattle production, those credits cannot be sold down the line and participate in other programs like All Natural, or maybe they have a low carbon beef or a carbon net zero beef. Because you've already sold those carbon credits, you cannot participate in those programs anymore. And so I think just understanding what it's providing you, and then what potentially is the market trade-off in the future as far as the meat goes that comes from that product is just understand kind of what you're signing up for.
Mhm.
And I would say it's also most of the people and the carbon companies that are out there have primarily focused on the crop side, and there's a handful of companies that have really tried to delve into the livestock or the cattle side in particular on how to capture and quantify carbon sequestration.
Great. Thank you both. I see no further questions right now. So still time to sneak one in there if something comes to your mind, but I'll just take this opportunity to thank both Elliott Dennis and Brad Lubben for their expertise today, and thank you especially for joining us on our webinar. And again, you can find the recording from this session as well as almost 3 years worth of recordings now from our weekly webinar series at cap.unl.edu. So with that, Elliott, Brad, if you have nothing further, then we'll go ahead and close this up and let people get on with their day.
Thank
I
you
think
everyone for coming.
I appreciate everybody that did participate. You're paying attention to us as opposed to some basketball games that are going on today. Plus it's snowing outside here, getting wider by the minute. So thank you and have a great day.